All right, so let's get going. I believe I left off, we finished with section 12.10 in the last lecture, so I'm going to jump right into section 12.11. So on this first whiteboard, I'm just going to write this. Sensory and motor pathways. And this is pretty much within the spinal cord, really within the central nervous system, but it's hooked up to the topic about the spinal cord. So some things to highlight here before we talk about specifics. All spinal tracts are multi-neuron pathways. When I say spinal tracts, we're just talking about the information highways that go sort of up and down the spinal cord. I'm just writing all spinal tracts are multi-neuron. So I know it's easy to think about, and it's also easy to teach, that neurons just go up and down the spinal cord in a superior and inferior direction. But all of the tracts are multi-neuron, have multiple neurons as well as multi-directional pathways within them. I'm just writing 4 things to consider when we talk about spinal tracts and pathways. First, I'll number these 1, 2, 3, 4. Most pathways are what we call decussation. Decussation is a word, it sounds like desiccation. This just means crossing over of pathways within the central nervous system. So most pathways decussate or exhibit some sort of decussation. I'm going to write exhibit. That just means crossing over specifically within the central nervous system. We use a different term called a chiasma for the peripheral nervous system. Crossing over meaning left to right, right to left. So most of the pathways somewhere within this pathway cross over from the right side to the left or the left side to the right. Most of these pathways consist of 2 to 3 neurons. I'm going to write in series. And we call this a relay. Just like runners running with a baton on a track, passing a baton, that's called a relay. Same thing. Number 3, most exhibit some sort of somatotopy. What that word means is that refers to a sort of geographical / functional map. They lie in a specific physical arrangement based on function. So sort of a spatial relationship. I think the example your book gives is, for example, pain and temperature receptors from the superior body, that means from the arms, shoulders, and head, lie medially to sensory receptors from the inferior part of the body. All this means is a physical map related also to function. And lastly, number 4, there is always some sort of symmetry. That just means if something's going up the left side, it's also going up the right side. So fibers, there's always a right and left component to and from the spinal cord and the brain along that central nervous system pathway. Now I'm going to just briefly highlight ascending pathways and then descending pathways. So I'm going to layer over this. We're talking about transmission pathways of nerve impulses ascending. That means going up the spinal cord. That's what this refers to. And it's somewhat intuitive, but I'm going to write anyway. This refers to the conduction of sensory afferent impulses toward the C and S, toward the central nervous system. So if those impulses must go all the way up to the brain to be processed, we're talking about coming into the spinal cord and then going all the way up to the brain. So the transmission pathway, this pathway includes what we say, it includes 3 neurons in relay or series. First, there is something called a first order neuron. You guessed it, that's just going to go first order neuron, second order neuron, third order neuron. First order just means they carry impulses from receptors. Your book uses examples, somatic examples. So I'm just going to say carry impulses specifically from receptors. In parentheses, I'm going to write in skin, for example, or what we call proprioceptors in our joints. I will go over the different types of receptors. So if proprioceptor seems confusing right now, don't worry, I'll define it later. That's just basically monitoring joint, there are specific sensory receptors in our joints and skeletal muscles that monitor things like body position. But I'll write all that out later, don't worry. These specific first order neurons have bodies, their cell bodies are clustered in ganglia, oftentimes in the peripheral nervous system, or from spinal nerves conducting sensory impulses elsewhere in the body, facial nerves, yada, yada, yada. For first order, just the main thing to remember is carry impulses from receptors. Second order, remember, this is a relay, a pathway going from either the external or internal environment picked up by a receptor and carried toward the central nervous system. In second order neurons, they're located typically the second arm of the pathway in medulla. And we're talking about the cell bodies are not clustered in the peripheral nervous system. The cell bodies are typically located in the medulla of the brainstem or the dorsal horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord. So the cell bodies, are located actually in the central nervous system itself. And finally, third order neurons, I'm going to go to a new board just so I have space. We're getting up to the brain area now. This is the last pathway in the sensory afferent pathway. These cell bodies are typically located in the thalamus, which is almost dead center tissue in the center of the brain. And they send information to the primary somatosensory cortex for processing or conscious interpretation. So that's just the order of events of the sensory pathway. I just forget if I put a kappa. Okay, so we used ascending pathways. I'm just going back to board. Now I'm going to do descending pathways. Let's talk about these briefly for a minute. Your book uses somatic examples, so I'll try to stick to that. Somatic meaning to voluntary skeletal muscles. So this would be efferent motor pathways. Think not sensory coming in, but sending commands to effector organs. Okay? There's basically two types. What we call, they used to have different names. I learned these as different names, but now they're called direct pathways and indirect pathways. Direct pathways just means they include pyramidal cells, specifically from the precentral gyri. Don't get all hung up in the language. The concept is this: it includes neurons coming directly from precentral gyri. In the brain. So they originate in the cortex of the brain. The indirect pathways is basically all other non-pyramidal cells from the brain. Oops, I forgot to write indirect pathways. This just indirect just basically means they are pathways that don't include these pyramidal cells from the cortex. So those are the two different classifications or categories or types of afferent descending pathways down the spinal cord. All of these, or most all of these pathways have 2 neurons, not 3. So I'm going to a new whiteboard just for space, but I'm still on this topic of descending pathways, descending motor efferent pathways. I'm just going to write most all have 2 neurons, what we call an upper motor neuron and something that we call a lower motor neuron. Remember, these are pathways going from the central nervous system out to an effector organ. aka some sort of command from the central nervous system after the sensory information has been processed. So these are typically from the motor cortex. In the cortex of the brain, or one of the association or subcortical motor nuclei from that area. The lower motor neurons are typically from the ventral horn of gray matter. In the spinal cord. So just as a reminder, the motor, that's what we're talking about here, efferent pathway, uses gray matter from the ventral horn, that's opposed to sensory information coming in, uses the dorsal horn of that gray matter in that anatomical slice that I drew 1 or 2 lectures ago of the spinal cord. Okay, now that pretty much takes care of the information that's going to be on quiz 6, which is tomorrow. So I've just quickly gone through the major topics within section, it was 12.11. Now I'm going to jump ahead to chapter 13. This information will not be on quiz 6 tomorrow. It will be on quiz 7 this coming Friday. But there's going to be more information on that one. Tomorrow's quiz is going to be, like I said, relatively short compared to the other ones you've taken. But quiz 7 will have more information again. So I do need to talk about that because I'm not going to have time to do it all before Friday. So we're going on to chapter 13, and we're going to talk specifically about sensory receptors and the process of sensation. So I'll highlight the major key points to this. Sensory receptors, this is the sensory afferent division of the nervous system that we're talking about. We're talking about all the way out at the beginning of this pathway. What receptors sense a change in either the external or internal environment. These words, exteroceptors, proprioceptors, and interoceptors, or intero, refer to classification of receptors based on their location. Exteroceptors monitor the external environment. So that's fairly easy if we look at this prefix. They would be receptors found in places like the skin, skeletal muscle, in the special sense organ. Proprioceptors monitor, their location is joints, skeletal muscles. They monitor body position, activity, position in space. They send signals to our brains to allow us to sit up straight and not fall over, stand up straight and not fall over. Interoceptors basically monitor the internal environment, our bodies, our visceral organs, temperature regulation, meaning internal body temperature regulation, not environmental temperature sensation, but things like if you have nausea, stomach discomfort, deep touch and pain receptors. Now we're going to just examine really briefly levels of integration. Based on these sensory receptors. There's 3 levels of integration, and they kind of mirror, not exactly, but they kind of mirror the first order, second order, and third order neurons that we went over in that sensory afferent pathway. So there's a receptor level, what's called a circuit level, and finally, perceptual level. This is a crude interpretation, but this is what's happening, obviously, at the receptor level, but monitoring either internal or external things. The circuit level is mostly just a pathway going from the receptor to the central nervous system. This is what's occurring within the central nervous system. So we'll just handle these in terms of 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to skip over mostly step 2. This is just processing at the receptor level. Let's briefly talk about number 1. First, there are requirements that need to be met in order for a receptor to fire, or in order for a receptor to actually turn on or work. And those requirements are the stimulus, whatever that is in the internal or external environment, must match the specificity of the receptor. Don't get hung up on that too much. It's really a simple concept. All that means is if we are being touched, for example, on our skin, the touch must be a touch or some sort of physical, mechanical, tactile stimulus in order to make those touch receptors work. That's pretty intuitive. The stimulus must also be within the receptor's receptive field. Let me erase that for a second. Receptors all that means is this. Let's use our example of touch again. If the touch on our skin is so light that it doesn't trigger to our touch receptors because they're not sensitive enough, then nothing's going to happen. So the stimulus must be at least strong enough to stimulate that receptor. And finally, the stimulus energy must be converted to a graded potential. It must be converted first to a graded potential, then reach threshold to fire an action potential. That's really what happens at a receptor. First, the stimulus must match the receptor specificity, then it must be within the receptor's field, aka strong enough for that receptor to pick it up. And third, the stimulus energy has to somehow be converted. For example, our touch example. If touch is a mechanical process, you know that, it's a depression of the skin. And here's the surface of the skin. Here's a touch receptor underneath that skin. It's basically just a coiled nerve ending. First, this receptor, I'm going to highlight it in red, this touch receptor only picks up the stimulus from depression of skin or touch. It's not going to pick up some other stimulus like temperature change, for example. So that's what number one means. It must match the receptor specificity. Second, the stimulus must be within the receptor's field. That means a light touch that is so light on the skin that it doesn't cause this stimulus to do anything. It doesn't actually ignite or turn on that receptor, isn't going to have an effect. But if the touch is strong enough that it actually depresses this nerve ending, then we say that the stimulus is within the receptor's field. And finally, the receptor itself must convert this touch mechanical process into some sort of electrical energy. And you know that the process is first a graded potential must occur, and then threshold of that cell must be met in order for the receptor, if this is the cell body of the receptor, and then we go all the way to the central nervous system or close to it, the graded potential must be strong enough for this cell to reach threshold and fire its own action potential toward the central nervous system. So that's what the processing business means. This term is within context. As I've said many times, I don't have time to reiterate every word in your textbook, but I do want to briefly talk about adaptation because it's in the context of sensory receptors. Adaptation is just a process that our receptors undergo when they are constantly stimulated. So this is defined as a change. You know what this is. You probably know what it is by name. But if you don't, this is a change in receptor sensitivity. In the presence of constant stimulation. That's a textbook definition. Classic example that's almost always given is you walk into a room, for example, that has a particular odor, either pleasant or unpleasant, and after you've been in the room for, say, a few minutes, let alone for a long time, that odor seems to, quote, go away. Well, it's not that the odor itself has disappeared, it's that the firing on your sensory receptors has decreased. So that's just a change in receptor sensitivity. The actual stimulus doesn't go away or change. It's the receptor sensitivity that changes. Likewise, if you have a hat on, you put a baseball cap on. When you first put it on, your sensory receptors fire and can sense that hat on your head very dramatically. But once it's on for an hour or 2 hours or all day, you don't even notice it. You don't even feel it. That's a change in receptor sensitivity, not necessarily in the stimulus itself. Not all sensory receptors exhibit adaptation. Touch receptors do, chemoreceptors do, and those are my two examples that I gave you. But oftentimes pain receptors do not, which is a good thing because we wouldn't want to get used to body injury that might cause us great harm and not still feel that pain, to remove ourselves from that situation or try to correct that situation. So that talks about the processing at the receptor level. There's a small blurb, I believe, in your textbook, I don't have it in front of me, about processing at the circuit level. That's just the second order neurons actually sending the pathway to the brain, to the thalamus of the brain. I'm not even going to go into that in detail. I'm going to jump right ahead to the third level of sensory processing, which is the processing at the perceptual level. So I'm going to skip number 2, the circuit level, and go on right to number 3. Just write processing at perceptual level. And I'm going to specifically focus on pain receptors. There's all different types of sensation, and they get sent to all the different cortexes within the brain. But this one is, and your book spends a long time on this as well, so I'm going to focus on perception of pain. In particular, pain receptors are activated by a whole group of types of receptors, particularly pressure, temperature, chemicals. By chemicals, I mean chemicals specifically released by damaged tissue, not chemicals in the air. So if you get a caustic chemical splashed on your skin, that causes tissue damage. Damaged tissues release chemicals, which signal the brain at the perceptual level of pain. We do have pain-suppressing chemicals as well that are typically released in the brain. So I'm going to list the 2 most common ones. The first one is going to be endorphins. You've heard of those. They're produced when we do something as simple as exercise. So they're sort of what are called pleasure-producing chemicals. Really what they are is pain-suppressing chemicals. And you might not have heard of this one, enkephalins or enkephalins. These are specifically inhibitory chemicals that dampen pain signals at within the brain itself. So remember, we're talking about the perceptual level here. When we take medication for pain, they can act in many different ways, but there's 2 basic ways that pain medications, pharmaceuticals act. They either act at the receptor level or the site of pain itself. For example, anti-inflammatories. If you take ibuprofen or naproxen, those are non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. That reduces inflammation at the site of injury. And the reduction of inflammation, that decreases pain. There are also things like prostaglandin blockers. Prostaglandins are chemicals they're pain-causing chemicals. Aspirin, for example, is a prostaglandin blocker. But then opiates, something like Oxycontin or the trade name Percocet, those actually act on the brain's perception of pain, and they behave very differently. All right, I'm going to move on. This is going to be the last topic of the day. I'm going to talk about sensation and perception of stimuli occurring at the brain. So classification of receptors by stimulus type. The first, back at this board, I believe I still have it, if I can find it. This one. These are receptors based on location. Exteroceptors, proprioceptors, interoceptors. Where I'm going to now is classification of receptors by stimulus type, not by the location within the body. We have mechanoreceptors, and as the name implies, these are receptors that are stimulated by some sort of mechanical stimulus, like touch, pressure, stretch receptors, vibrations. We can pick those up as well. I'm just going to call up a new board. I can squeeze thermoreceptors. That's pretty easy. It's just temperature changes. Now I'll call up a new board. We have photoreceptors in the retina of the eye. These would be rods and cones located in the retina of the eye, and they sense light wavelengths in the atmosphere. Both color wavelengths as well as light and dark. Chemoreceptors, largely found in the nasal cavity, things like smell and taste. These are just basically nerve endings. They can also change, they can also sense a change in body fluid chemistry. So I'm going to write also what does that mean? Specifically, we have chemoreceptors in our vascular system monitoring things like a change in oxygen concentration or CO2 concentration. And the last one that I'm going to list are nociceptors, N-O-C-I. These are a special class of pain receptors. They sense all sorts of things. Give you some example. Temperature extremes, excessive pressure, you know that you run into something or you bang an appendage or smash your finger with a hammer, that's excessive pressure. Inflammation, and inflammatory chemicals. That's really from tissue damage. So our nociceptors can sense all of those things and cause the perception of pain within the brain. So I'm going to list this out for you. This is based on stimulus type: mechano, thermo, photo, chemo, and NOCI. I'm going to go back to the first three based on, and just give you some more detail. The first three based on location, classification by location. I know I said this, I'm going to write some of this down for you. This was our exteroceptors. These monitor the external environment. So things like, I'm just going to write, we find these on the body's surface, in parentheses, touch, pain, pressure, temperature. So we find all of these types are, if they're on the monitoring the external world, they're called exteroceptors. Interoceptors are a group that monitor our internal environment, our visceral organs. So we have internal environment. And we have things like chemical receptors here, chemoreceptors, stretch receptors, temp, pain, and finally proprioceptors. These lie within skeletal muscles and joints. That's their location. They're also found within, specifically, all of the tissues of a joint, like tendons and ligaments. These monitor body movement and position. All right, I'm going to call it good there for today. Let me just shut down my recording, and then I'm going to say a couple more words to you.